The scars on my hands don't come from war or factory labor. They came from carrying water in the dead of winter, scrubbing floors until my knuckles bled, and keeping a boy alive when the world around us didn't seem to care if he survived or not. Every mark has a story, some too painful to tell. But today, at 88 years old, I've outlived my fear. It's time I shared the truth. My name is Etta Stone, and I was born in 1935 in Damariscotta, Maine, a quiet town that clung to the curves of the Damariscotta River like it was afraid to let go. These days, folks know me as the old woman who still bakes cinnamon rolls for the church fair and always leaves an extra blanket in the back pew just in case someone needs warmth more than the sermon. But once, long ago, I was a 16-year-old girl who lost her mother and nearly lost her mind in the weeks that followed. It all started in the fall of 1953. I remember the day like a painting burned into memory. The trees were halfway to bare, and the air carried that sharp wood smoke scent that always signaled the end of comfort and the beginning of cold. It was also the day I stopped being a child. My mother, Maybelle Stone, had the gentlest singing voice this side of the river and hands that always smelled of lemon balm and flower. She died in the middle of the night from pneumonia. These days, doctors have pills to fix it, but back then, when your lungs filled with water and your breath turned to a rattle, it was just a matter of how long. She went fast. One day she was humming Shenandoah in the kitchen while peeling apples. By the end of the week, her side of the bed was cold, and our home was quiet in a way that made you afraid to breathe too loud. Daddy didn't talk about it. He didn't cry, not even at the funeral. He just started working longer shifts for the railroad, spending days, sometimes weeks away from home. And so it was just me and my little brother, Teddy. He was 7, with a cowlick that wouldn't stay down no matter how hard Mama used to smooth it, and eyes that asked too many questions I couldn't answer. Why doesn't Mama come back? He'd ask in whispers when the oil lamp flickered low. She's one of the stars now, I'd say, brushing his hair back, mimicking the way Mama used to, the one that shines the brightest. That's her. I did what I could. I cooked. I cleaned. I traded eggs from our hens for sugar or flour from Miss Maddie across the road. I even took in washing for the local doctor's wife, hard work, for a girl with hands barely grown into themselves. At night, I'd lie awake and bury my face in Mama's old pillow just to remember what safety used to smell like. I was 16, but my shoulders already ached with the weight of a mother's job, a father's absence, and the silence that grief carves into a house. We were getting by, barely. And then, just when the days began to turn dark before supper, and the winds pushed through the cracks in the windows, Daddy came home early. It was a Wednesday afternoon, warm for October, but I remember how the air changed the moment the train whistle blew, too early, too sharp. From the kitchen window, I saw him walking up the path with someone beside him. She was shorter than him, with curled brown hair, lipstick far too red for a town like ours, and a bright floral dress that looked plucked straight from a city window display. I'd never seen her before, but I knew what was coming. Etta, Teddy, come out and meet Marjorie, he said, placing a hand on her lower back like he'd practiced it. She's going to be your new mother, just like that. No warning, no conversation, no space for grief. Marjorie smiled, her lips red as a barn door, and leaned down to pat my hair. Finally, she said, I'll have the daughter I always wanted. Something in her voice rang sweet, but her eyes were hard, eyes that measured, eyes that remembered things they never should have seen. Teddy clung to my skirt. I stood frozen. If I had known then what was waiting for us behind her smile, what would happen once Daddy left again, I might have run right then, might have grabbed Teddy and disappeared into the trees behind our house. But I didn't, because girls like me didn't run. We endured. And that, my dears, was the beginning of a story I kept buried in my chest for 70 years. But I'm not burying it anymore, because some stories, especially the painful ones, aren't meant to stay silent. They're meant to be told. Marjorie came into our lives like a bright ribbon tied around a box you weren't allowed to open. From the outside, she sparkled. She smiled with teeth too white and spoke with a soft southern drawl that made the women at church lean in a little too eagerly. But beneath it all, I could feel it, that hum of something tightly wound, something waiting to snap. Daddy was smitten. I hadn't seen him laugh since Mama died, but that week he laughed twice. Once, when Marjorie tried to milk our stubborn old cow and ended up with manure on her shoes, and once again when Teddy called her Miss Marge by accident and she pouted like a schoolgirl. He took it as flirtation. I wasn't so sure. Still, I tried. Lord knows I did. I kept my mouth shut and my hands busy. That's what Mama always said. If your hands are full, your tongue won't get you in trouble. So I scrubbed floors that didn't need scrubbing, baked cornbread even when we didn't have enough butter, and watched Marjorie through careful glances over the rim of my dishwater. At first, things really did seem better. The house was cleaner than it had ever been. Marjorie brought in lace curtains and polished the old hutch until it gleamed. She filled the kitchen with the smells of Sunday roast even on a Tuesday and made sure Daddy's shirts were pressed with a crispness that looked straight out of a catalog. It was like someone had turned the volume back up in our quiet little world. Even Teddy seemed taken with her. She told him bedtime stories about when I was a girl in Charleston, stories full of fireflies and riverboats and summer carnivals. His eyes would go wide with wonder, and I'd watch from the doorway as his small body relaxed into sleep, lulled by her honeyed voice. I wanted to believe. One night, I found her kneeling beside Teddy's bed, smoothing his hair. "You've got a precious little brother there," she said, standing up. "The kind of boy I always wanted, if God had seen fit to give me one." There was a long pause as she looked at me. "And you," she added, "you're strong. I like strong girls. I never had a daughter. You know." I didn't answer. I just nodded. Lips pressed tight. That was the first time I felt it. Not fear. Exactly. Something quieter, colder. A sense that I was being watched, not for who I was, but for how I could be molded. She moved into Mama's old sewing room. Daddy had insisted. Even though I had begged him once to keep that room the way it was, her smell still lingered in the drawers, and her thimbles were lined up like tiny silver soldiers. But Marjorie didn't hesitate. Within days, the lace was gone, the photos boxed away, and the walls smelled of jasmine instead of lavender. "I thought you might want to help me unpack," she said one afternoon, motioning me inside. I hesitated at the doorway. The room felt wrong, too bright, too full of perfume. Still, I stepped in, out of duty if nothing else. I helped fold scarves and stack shoes. Then, in one drawer tucked beneath a pile of gloves, I found a photograph. A little girl in a gingham dress stood between Marjorie and a man I didn't recognize. Her smile was tight, her body pressed to the man's side. The back read, "Frank, Marjorie, and Clara, 1947. Who's Clara?" I asked without thinking. Marjorie turned so fast I barely saw her hand snatch the picture. Her eyes, so warm when Daddy was around, had turned to steel. "Don't go poking in things that don't concern you," she said, low and sharp. Her fingernail had nicked my finger in the scuffle. A thin line of blood beaded along my skin, but I didn't say a word. From that moment on, I knew. I couldn't explain it yet, but I knew there was something behind the lipstick and cornbread, something colder than a Maine winter and just as dangerous. Later that night, while we sat at dinner, Daddy leaned back in his chair, looking content for the first time in months. "I've been called north," he said. "Railroads expanding past Augusta. They want me there for 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Marjorie smiled and placed her hand over his. "Don't worry, Joseph. I'll take care of everything here. The children and I will be just fine." Her voice was syrup, but her eyes flicked to me sharp and unblinking. Teddy glanced at me, his fork stilled halfway to his mouth. I wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but I didn't, because in that moment, I was just a girl again, one who had already lost too much, and I had no idea that the worst was yet to come. The morning Daddy left, the sky was pale and clean, like it hadn't yet decided what kind of day it wanted to be. I stood on the gravel platform with Teddy's small hand gripping mine, both of us waving as the train chugged off toward Augusta. The engine's whistle echoed long after it vanished around the bend, and with it, our last shred of protection slipped away. Marjorie didn't say a word on the walk back to the house, not a single one. Her heels clicked against the dirt path, and each click felt like a countdown. By the time we reached the porch, her smile had evaporated. Once the door closed behind us, it was like a switch flipped. She yanked off her scarf and kicked off her polished shoes with a grunt. Her voice dropped an octave, stripped of sweetness. "Well," she said, sighing as she unbuttoned her dress at the collar, "now we can get some real work done." She walked straight to Daddy's glass-fronted cabinet, the one that held the bottle of whiskey he only opened on Christmas or when the pastor visited. She poured herself 2 fingers full, tossed it back like water, and turned to face us. "Let's get one thing straight," she said, pointing at me first. "I'm not your mother. I never will be. You'll call me ma'am, and you'll do exactly as I say." "Understood." I stood there frozen, not knowing what to say. "And you," she turned to Teddy, who had stepped behind my skirt like he always did when he was scared. "No more crying for your mama. You hear she's dead. And this house needs order, not whimpering." I felt Teddy flinch. I knelt beside him, placed my hand over his shoulder, trying to be his shield, but I was 16. What could I really protect him from? From that moment, our lives became a series of commands. Marjorie gave me a list that looked like it belonged to a whole army of housekeepers. Scrub the floors on your hands and knees, no mops allowed. Wash all the laundry in the cold with lye soap. Polish the silver we only ever used at Christmas. Cook breakfast, lunch, and dinner from scratch. Clean the chicken coop, weed the vegetable patch, dust every picture frame. Teddy, small as he was, got his own list, chopping kindling, hauling water from the well almost half a mile away, rinsing vegetables in cold creek water that turned his fingers red. One morning I caught him trying to lift a bucket nearly as big as he was, the leather handle cutting into his small hands. "Stop that," I yelled, rushing toward him. Marjorie was there before I could reach him. "You think he'll break," she said, her voice low and mocking. "Let him build some strength. This world doesn't go easy on boys who stay soft." "He's 7, I cried. The slap came so fast I didn't see it coming. My cheek burned. I stumbled back, stunned. "Don't ever raise your voice to me again," She hissed, "Unless you want your daddy hearing how you've been nothing but defiant since the day I arrived. He called me last night. You know, she was lying. We had no phone, and the nearest neighbor with a working line lived almost 2 miles away, but I was too shocked to think straight. Teddy looked at me, eyes wide, mouth trembling. I wanted to run. I wanted to fight. But mostly, I wanted my father his silence, his awkwardness. Even his absence, anything was better than this cruelty and lipstick. That night, Marjorie ate dinner first, alone. She took the best cuts of the roast I had spent hours preparing, scooped the mashed potatoes like a queen at her throne, and finished off the warm bread from the cast iron skillet. Only after she had eaten her fill did she nod to us. "You may serve yourselves," she said with a smirk. There was barely enough for one. I split my portion with Teddy, pretending I wasn't hungry, but my stomach gnawed at me as I watched him eat. At bedtime, Teddy crept into my room. He didn't say a word at first, just climbed into bed and curled against me like he used to when thunderstorms rolled over the bay. "There are noises in my room," he whispered, "scratching sounds. I think there's something in the walls." But I knew it wasn't the walls he feared. "It's okay," I whispered back, brushing his hair like Mama used to do. "You can stay here." That became our routine. He'd sneak into my room most nights, whispering apologies for disturbing me, but I never minded. In those quiet hours, I'd hum old lullabies. Oh, Susanna, Shenandoah, and Mama's favorite, Amazing Grace. He'd fall asleep before the last verse, his breath finally even and slow, but morning always came, and with it, Marjorie's voice, sharp as a knife, slicing through peace. "Etta, where's that firewood, Teddy? This slop won't feed the chickens themselves." The days blurred together long, gray stretches of labor and silence. My fingers cracked and bled from washing in cold water. Teddy's arms grew thin, but he never complained. We had no calendar, no clock, just the sun and the work. And when the sky darkened and the work was done, we collapsed onto our beds, only to do it all again. There were moments, though, when I saw it, the monster behind Marjorie's mask, like when Teddy dropped one of her porcelain teacups by accident. For a heartbeat, her whole face twisted into something unrecognizable, a mask of fury. Then just as quickly, it was gone. "Accidents happen, sweetie," she cooed. But her eyes burned. I began to plan. I knew I couldn't stop her. Not with strength, not with words, but I could work around her, protect Teddy in small ways, hide extra biscuits in the woodpile, whisper warnings when her mood turned black. A system was forming in my mind, built not from power, but from desperation. And soon, I'd need every piece of it, because the worst hadn't come yet. It was still waiting. In the shadow of a fevered night, it happened on the 5th day after Daddy left. I was scrubbing the baseboards in the front parlor with an old toothbrush, Marjorie's latest demand, when I heard a soft grunt through the open window. I turned my head and caught sight of Teddy. He was staggering across the yard with 2 large metal buckets, water sloshing out the sides and soaking the front of his shirt and trousers. Each bucket was nearly as wide as his chest. He could barely lift them. "Faster, boy." Marjorie clapped from the porch, her hands slicing through the still morning air. "The cistern won't fill itself." I dropped the brush and ran outside, hands still dripping with soapy water. "He's too small," I shouted. "You'll hurt his back." The blow landed before I finished the sentence. Her hand cracked across my cheek so fast and so hard that I stumbled back, my vision flashing white. I pressed a palm to my burning face, blinking away tears not from the pain, but from shock. "You want another," she hissed. Teddy dropped the buckets and ran to me, sobbing. I pulled him close. "You listen to me, little girl," she snarled. "If you ever raise your voice again or talk back, I'll tell your father just how rebellious you've been. He called me again last night, said he's already worried about your attitude. It was another lie. We didn't have a telephone. The only one in town was at the post office, 2 miles down the hill. But her words didn't have to be true. They only had to scare. And they did, because the worst part was she knew exactly how much I feared disappointing Daddy. He'd finally started smiling again since marrying her. He'd finally found some sliver of peace. I couldn't take that from him, not after everything he'd lost. So I swallowed my pride, bit my tongue, and told Teddy, "It's okay, just go inside." But it wasn't okay. That evening, after Marjorie had her dinner and left us with scraps, Teddy followed me into the kitchen. He said nothing, just stood there, his eyes glassy and his little hands clutching his sides. "What's wrong?" I asked gently. He looked away. Nothing. But as he turned, I caught a glimpse of red beneath his collar. I stepped closer. Teddy. When I lifted his shirt, I forgot how to breathe. Thin, parallel welts slashed across his back, pink, swollen, and raw. Some had already begun to scab. Others were fresh, the skin puffed and angry. "She said it was our secret," he whispered. "She said if I told, she'd send me away, to a place where they hit harder." I sank to my knees and wrapped my arms around him, careful not to touch the wounds. My whole body shook, not with fear, but with something hotter, something darker. Rage, pure, helpless rage. But rage alone wouldn't save him. That night, while he slept beside me, curled tight like a question mark, I stared at the ceiling and made a vow. She would not touch him again. I didn't have strength or power, but I had my wits, and in that moment, they became my greatest weapon. I began creating what I called the protection system. It started simple. First rule, Teddy was never to be alone with her. Ever. "If she tells you to go somewhere," I whispered early one morning, "say you have to use the bathroom. Then come find me." He nodded. He was scared, but he trusted me. That trust was everything. I taught him a set of signals. One short whistle meant she's coming. 2 quick whistles meant hide. 1 long whistle meant safe to come out. We practiced behind the chicken coop until he could whistle just like me. Second rule, I'd wake up before dawn and do as many chores as possible before she even stirred from bed. If I worked fast, maybe I could do Teddy's share too. By the time the rooster crowed, I'd already filled half the cistern, fed the hens, and started coffee. I was running on less than 4 hours of sleep a night, but it didn't matter. What mattered was shielding him. When she woke and saw the chores done, she looked suspicious. "What's all this?" she muttered one morning. "I thought it might please you." "Ma'am," I said, keeping my eyes low, to start the day with everything in order. She narrowed her eyes, but said nothing. She poured herself coffee and sat in silence. Third rule, food. She rationed every bite, and Teddy was growing thinner by the day, so I started hiding crumbs, a biscuit tucked in my apron, a boiled egg wrapped in a rag, hidden under a floorboard loose behind the stove. I snuck him food every chance I got. At night, I wrapped him in an extra quilt and held him close. "You're safe here," I'd whisper, and he'd nod, even if neither of us really believed it. There were close calls. One afternoon, She nearly caught him sneaking a piece of cornbread I'd saved. I spilled flour across the kitchen floor to cause a distraction. "What are you doing, girl?" "I saw a rat, ma'am." I lied. "Near the pantry." She hated rats. I'd discovered that early on. Just the word made her shiver. It gave Teddy time to hide. Every day was a game of survival. I tracked her moods like weather. Puffy eyes meant she'd been drinking more volatile. A furrowed brow and drumming fingers meant a punishment was brewing. When that happened, I stepped in. Once, when she looked ready to lash out at Teddy for dropping a bucket, I threw myself in front of him and said, "I'll take his chores today." He didn't sleep well. Must be coming down with something. She glared but relented. I had bought him one more day. And that's how we lived day by day, minute by minute, every second calculated, every glance weighed. My body ached. My soul was tired. But Teddy was still smiling sometimes. That was enough. For now, the storm came without warning. One minute the sky over Damariscotta was a low gray sheet. The next, it cracked open like a split log, spilling thunder and rain that fell sideways against the windows. The kind of storm you feel in your bones, the kind you don't forget. Inside the house, the air turned thick and hot, clinging to the skin like wool. The storm rattled the roof, but what truly rattled me was the look on Teddy's face during supper. He hadn't touched a bite of the beans and bread I'd scraped together. His cheeks were flushed, his eyes glassy. He barely lifted his spoon. "Are you all right?" I whispered across the table, trying to sound casual. He gave a tiny nod, but I could see the tremble in his hands. "Ma'am," he mumbled to Marjorie. "May I be excused?" Marjorie, who had just finished her second glass of Daddy's whiskey, squinted at him. "Leave firewood by the stove for the morning." "Yes, ma'am." He got up slowly, dragging his feet as he went. I waited just long enough for Marjorie to pour another drink before slipping away. In Teddy's room, I found him huddled under the blanket, shivering despite the thick summer heat. One touch to his forehead told me everything I needed to know. He was burning up. "Cece," he whispered, calling me by the name only Mama used. "Everything hurts." His voice was so small. I pressed my lips together, fighting the panic clawing its way up my throat. This wasn't just a cold. In 1953, a fever like that wasn't a thing you waited out. Without antibiotics, it could mean pneumonia, infection, even death. I ran to the kitchen and put water on to boil. I made a tea with orange leaves and honey, the one Mama swore by. I soaked cloths in cold water, placing them on his forehead, under his arms, on the backs of his knees. I worked in silence, my own heart thudding like thunder. In the living room, Marjorie had dozed off in Daddy's armchair, her head slumped, mouth open slightly. The empty whiskey glass sat beside her like a warning. I hesitated. I didn't want her help. I didn't want her near us. But I needed her. And Teddy needed a doctor. The only one nearby lived 12 miles away, and we had no car, no phone, no neighbors close enough to hear us scream through the rain. I walked into the living room and touched her shoulder. "Ma'am," I said softly. She jolted upright, eyes wide. For a second, I saw something like fear flash through them. Then she focused. "What the hell is it?" "It's Teddy," I said. "He's got a terrible fever. He's shaking. He's not making sense. We need help." She groaned and sat up straighter, blinking. "Tea and rest. He'll be fine in the morning." "He's not fine," I snapped, louder than I meant to. "Please, come see for yourself," she muttered under her breath, but followed. When she stepped into Teddy's room and saw him sweating, gasping, whispering for Mama. Something shifted in her. Her brows drew together and her lips tightened. "How long's he been like this since this afternoon?" I said. She leaned down, touched his forehead, then pressed her fingers under his chin, checking his pulse. "Your father would skin me alive if something happened to this boy," she muttered. And then she changed. The cruel edge, the tight lips, the fire behind her eyes, it all fell away. What remained was something else entirely, something almost maternal. She rolled up her sleeves. "We've got to get that fever down. Now." I stood stunned. "Get more cold water," she ordered. "And if there's alcohol in the pantry, bring it. Rubbing it into his skin will help draw the heat out." I obeyed without a word. For the next 2 hours, we worked side by side in the flickering lantern light. The wind howled outside, but we were too busy to notice. She placed compresses on Teddy's neck and armpits, whispering directions to me like a trained nurse. She mixed herbs she'd kept in a tin at the bottom of her trunk. "My mother was a midwife," she said. "I've seen fever like this before. He's right on the edge." At one point, Teddy jerked upright in bed, eyes wide and unseeing. His body seized. I screamed, "Hold him." Marjorie barked. I grabbed his arms. His body spasmed against me. And then it was over. He fell limp, gasping. I was shaking, soaked with sweat. But Marjorie didn't flinch. She checked his pupils, whispered his name, massaged his legs. "Clara used to get fevers like this," she said softly, more to herself than to me. One night I thought I'd lost her. I said nothing, but I didn't hate her in that moment. She cried once, just briefly. Silent tears as she held a damp cloth to his forehead. She looked human, fragile, not the monster I'd feared for weeks. Around 4 a.m, Teddy's breathing evened out. The color returned to his face. His fever, though still there, had lessened. "He's going to be all right," she said, sinking to the floor. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat was too tight. At 5 o'clock, I heard the train whistle in the distance. Daddy would be home soon. Marjorie stood and looked at me. "Go get some rest," she said quietly. "I'll make breakfast for your father." I blinked. She said it kindly. Kindly. When she left the room, I sat on the edge of Teddy's bed, brushing the damp hair from his forehead. He stirred. "I dreamed of Mama," he murmured. She said everything would be all right. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "It will be," I whispered. "I promise." And somehow, despite everything that had come before, I believed it. That night changed everything. Not in the way you hope for in fairy tales, not with forgiveness or love or sudden happily ever afters, but in the quiet aftermath of survival. Something shifted. For the first time, I saw the woman behind the cruelty, the grief, the madness. And maybe, just maybe, she saw in us what she had lost, a child worth saving. The house smelled of wood smoke and damp wool the morning Daddy came home. Teddy was still asleep, curled like a comma beneath the quilt, his breathing steady, soft, almost musical. I sat beside him on the edge of the bed, watching the light through the lace curtain inch across the floor, downstairs. I heard Marjorie humming. It wasn't a tune I recognized, just a low, tuneless sound, but not unpleasant. She moved with a quiet energy I hadn't seen before, setting out breakfast dishes, slicing bread, wiping the kitchen counter with slow, circular strokes. Her hair was brushed. Her dress, the floral one she'd worn the day Daddy introduced her, was pressed and clean. By the time the train whistle echoed down the hill, Marjorie had already pulled a fresh pie from the oven. She met Daddy at the platform, smiling as if the night before had never happened. From the window, I saw them embrace her head tucked beneath his chin, his hand resting lightly on her back. She took his suitcase, and they strolled together toward the house. It looked so ordinary, like a Norman Rockwell painting, but nothing felt ordinary to me anymore. When they came inside, Marjorie spoke first. Teddy's resting. He had a little fever last night, but we managed it. She didn't lie. Not exactly. But she didn't tell the truth either. Daddy dropped his bag and headed straight for Teddy's room. I followed behind him, silent. He stood at the foot of the bed, gazing down at his son. "How is he really?" he asked. I met his eyes. It was a hard night. The fever got bad, real bad. He looked pale. "Why didn't you send for the doctor?" "There was no way," I said. "The storm. The roads." We stayed up all night with him. We did what we could. Behind us, Marjorie appeared in the doorway. "We took care of him," she added, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. Cecilia was tireless. I turned toward her, stunned. That was the first time she'd ever praised me. Our eyes met, and for one strange second, I saw it the smallest flicker of something like gratitude. But the moment passed quickly. Daddy nodded, looking from her to me. "I don't know what I'd do without you girls." Girls, I almost laughed. That evening, after supper, when Teddy was awake and eating again, Daddy went to town for supplies. Marjorie returned to her room with a book and a third glass of whiskey. I lingered on the porch, listening to the frogs in the marsh and the wind whispering through the trees. And then I saw it. The rocking chair was still swaying slightly. She'd only just left it. A brown leather-bound notebook lay forgotten on the seat. I hesitated. I knew it was wrong. Knew that Mama would have scolded me for going through another woman's private things. But I also knew that answers sat inside that book, answers I couldn't ask for out loud. My fingers trembled as I picked it up and opened to the first page. The handwriting was elegant, slanted, with small, careful loops. April 12th, 1946. Clara laughed so hard today. She spilled lemonade all over her dress. Frank said she's got my stubborn streak. My stomach dropped. Clara, the name from the photograph. The little girl I'd once seen smiling between Marjorie and a man who wasn't my father. Page after page, the diary told a story I never expected. Marjorie hadn't always been cruel. She'd once been a mother, a wife, a woman who baked lemon bars for church picnics and walked her daughter to school, even in the rain. There were entries about Clara's tooth fairy letters, about fights with her husband Frank, about depression that came and went like tides. And then, abruptly, it changed. November 3rd, 1948, Frank took her, said I wasn't fit, that I scared her, that she cried at night when I screamed in my sleep. I begged him not to take her. My heart thudded. She had lost custody because of periods of rage and sorrow she couldn't control. A judge ruled her unstable. Frank left town. Clara vanished from her life. She searched. Twice she traveled to New York, hoping to find them. Both times, she failed. March 1951. I watched a girl on the train who looked like Clara. I followed her until she stepped into a building and disappeared. I stood outside for hours, but it wasn't her. I turned to the last written page. Joseph doesn't know. About Clara. About Frank. About how badly I broke. But when I look at Teddy, when he smiles the way Clara did, something inside me cracks. I want to love them, but the love curdles, turns bitter, and I don't know how to stop it. I close the diary gently, my hands numb. I didn't know what I had expected to find proof of evil. Maybe, but what I found instead was pain, untreated, buried, festering pain. It didn't excuse anything she'd done, not the slaps, not the punishments, not the scars on Teddy's back, but it made sense of them. She hadn't just lost her child, she'd lost herself. That night, I returned the diary to the chair, exactly how I'd found it. I didn't tell her I had read it, not then, but I looked at her differently. She wasn't just the monster who had tormented us. She was the ghost of someone who used to be whole. The next morning, I placed a single wildflower in a jar on the kitchen table, a daisy, just like the ones Mama used to tuck behind my ear. When Marjorie saw it, she paused. "What's that for?" Something Mama used to say. I replied, "Folding laundry nearby. Flowers make any room warmer." She said nothing, but she didn't throw it away. She placed it in a glass with water and left it there all day. A small moment, a tiny shift, but for us, it was everything. Life didn't change overnight after the fever, but something invisible shifted, like the way you can tell a thunderstorm has passed by the smell of the air. Even when the ground is still wet, Marjorie didn't soften, not in any way you'd notice from the outside. She still gave orders, still watched us with those unblinking eyes, but the sting behind her words dulled. The punishments, especially the ones meant for Teddy, stopped altogether, and that, to me, was as good as a ceasefire. I didn't trust her, not completely, but I began to understand her rhythms. When she poured her second drink before sundown, I knew to keep Teddy close. When she stayed up late staring out the window, I knew she was thinking about Clara. And when she didn't speak for long stretches, I didn't take it as hostility anymore, just distance. Grief's quieter cousin. I kept up the protection system, but it evolved. Teddy and I still used the whistle signals, though less often now. I still kept biscuits hidden in the woodpile and jam wrapped in cloth under the back step. Old habits die hard when you've been in survival mode. But I no longer woke in terror each morning, bracing for what she might do next. And in that space between fear and forgiveness, there grew something strange, coexistence. Sometimes I'd find her in the kitchen, staring at the recipe card box Mama left behind. One morning, I took a chance. "You ever make cornbread?" I asked, not looking directly at her. She glanced up. "Not since Charleston." I didn't press, just waited. Then she rose, wiped her hands on her apron, and said, "Well, if we're going to do it, we'll do it right. Fetch the skillet." We made it together in silence. She measured the cornmeal with a practiced hand, threw in just a touch of molasses, and poured the batter with a kind of reverence. When it came out of the oven, golden and crisp, she let Teddy have the first slice. He blinked at her, then looked at me. I nodded. "Thank you, ma'am," he whispered. She didn't smile, but she gave a short nod. It became a dance, careful, measured, but more choreographed than before. Some days, she snapped at me over small things. Other days, she asked me to walk with her to the post office, like she didn't want to go alone. Once, she handed me a spool of thread and asked if I knew how to fix a torn hem. "Not well," I replied. "Better than nothing," she said, handing it over. At night, she'd sit in Mama's old rocker, the one she once claimed as her own, and stare at the stars. I noticed she began to keep a blanket nearby, tossed over the back of the chair. And once or twice, She called Teddy sweetheart. Though the word came out stiff and foreign in her mouth, there was no warmth between us. Not exactly, but the cruelty faded like an old bruise, still tender, but not burning. The townsfolk, of course, saw none of this. At Sunday church, they'd comment on how well-adjusted we looked, how civilized we'd become under Marjorie's care. She's got a good head on her shoulders. The pastor's wife told Daddy after service one morning. A firm hand, too. Those kids needed structure. I wanted to scream, but I didn't, because part of me knew it was true. We had changed, just not in the way they thought. We weren't obedient. We were resilient. There's a difference. One rainy afternoon, I found her outside, kneeling beside the tiny garden I'd secretly kept alive behind the shed. The garden had started as a means of survival: lettuce, carrots, and a few radishes hidden beneath broad leaves. But now, it was simply routine. "What are you doing?" I asked, wary. She looked up at me without malice. "Your radishes are too close together," she said. "They'll choke each other out." I swallowed. "You knew about the garden, I always knew," she replied. "Didn't say anything because I figured you had your reasons." I waited for more. A rebuke. A threat. But she stood, brushed off her apron, and nodded toward the far corner. "The soil's better near the fence. You'll get better yield there." That was it. No lecture, no shame, just advice. I stood there long after she walked away, trying to make sense of what had just happened. In that small, quiet exchange, she'd offered something rare. Not kindness, exactly, but acknowledgement, a small gesture of trust. And I realized something: Marjorie had stopped trying to control us. Not because she cared, necessarily, but because maybe, just maybe, she was tired of fighting ghosts. We still lived on edge, but it was a softer edge now, one we'd learned to navigate with care. In those weeks, I began to feel something I hadn't dared to feel since Mama died. Stability. It wasn't love. It wasn't healing, but it was a start. And for a girl who'd once mapped escape routes in the floorboards and counted bruises by moonlight, that was more than enough. I hadn't seen Sophie Miller in nearly 4 years when she walked through the door of Mr. Kenny's grocery one muggy afternoon in March. She'd grown taller and thinner, with the quiet poise of someone who had seen the world beyond Damariscotta and had chosen to come back anyway. "Etta Stone," she said, squinting at me beneath the brim of her straw hat. "Don't tell me it's really you. It's me," I said, stunned. "You're home, just for a while," she smiled, "helping with the church festival. I'm back from the seminary in Atlanta, studying to teach. You've grown up, girl." We hugged right there between the barrels of flour and the rack of canned peaches. Her arms felt like safety, something I hadn't known in a long time. She waited while Mr. Kenny packed her order, and we caught up in soft tones, like two kids hiding a secret. Then her voice dipped lower. "And how's your new stepmother?" she asked carefully. "Your daddy seems real pleased." I hesitated. Words stacked up behind my teeth, but none of them felt safe. I'd kept the truth sealed so tightly for so long. I didn't know how to loosen the lid without spilling everything. Sophie must have seen the storm in my silence, because she reached for my hand and squeezed it gently. "The walls of country homes have ears," she said, "but the sacristy doesn't. Come see me after 6 Mass tomorrow. If you need to talk, I'll be there." The next morning, I walked into the small side room of the church, my boots soaked from snowmelt, heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. Sophie sat on a wooden stool, waiting. When I didn't speak right away, she didn't rush me. She just listened. And once I started, I couldn't stop. I told her everything. About the list of chores Marjorie handed me like a sentence. About the slap that made my ears ring. About Teddy crying into my pillow, trembling at her voice. About the welts on his back. About the whistles and the hidden food. About the fever. The night that changed something in all of us. I told her about the diary. And about Clara. Sophie didn't interrupt once. Her face stayed calm, but her fingers clenched slowly in her lap, like she was trying to keep herself from reacting too quickly. When I finally finished, she exhaled a long breath and reached for my hand again. "What you did for your brother," she said, "is extraordinary. Most girls your age wouldn't have survived, let alone shielded someone else through it." "I don't feel strong," I whispered. "You were strong every day you stayed," she replied. "Every time you stood between him and harm, and you're strong now for choosing to speak." We sat in silence for a while, the thick velvet curtain behind her muting the sound of early risers leaving the sanctuary. "What should I do?" I asked finally. "Tell my daddy blow it all wide open." Sophie thought for a moment. Then she said something I never forgot. "You have to trust your own knowing, Etta. But remember, secrets rarely stay buried. Not forever. Sooner or later, truth finds a way out. The question is whether it breaks things or heals them when it does." I nodded, not because I knew what choice I'd make, but because I finally felt I didn't have to carry the decision alone. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like a little girl lost in a grown woman's nightmare. I felt like someone who could decide her own next step. When I left the church, the snow had started to melt under the morning sun. I stopped at the riverbank on my way home, watching the ice break apart and drift downstream, shifting, splitting, and giving way to something new. It didn't happen that day, or the next, but Sophie's words had planted something in me. Courage, maybe, or the beginning of it. 3 weeks after my talk with Sophie, I came home from the store to find Marjorie kneeling in the garden. It was the same patch behind the shed, the one I had once kept hidden like a secret diary. But now the rows were straight, the soil freshly turned. She was tugging at weeds with slow, deliberate movements, her apron already stained with earth. "What are you doing?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my heart was racing. I hadn't expected her to touch that space, let alone tend it. She looked up slowly. "These lettuces are too shallow. They'll bolt before they root. You knew about the garden." She gave a half smile, sad, tired. "I always knew." I stood there a moment, unsure what to say. The breeze caught her hair, silvering the tips where she'd missed with the dye. The spring sun broke through the clouds in thin rays, making her look older, somehow more real. "I got a letter today," she said finally, rising to her feet. "From Frank." I froze. So much time had passed since I'd read about him in her diary. I'd almost forgotten he existed, almost forgotten the thread that tied her to another life, to another child. Her voice was steady, but flat. "Clara died 3 months ago. Meningitis. She was 12. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't think of a single word to say. She was almost Teddy's age," she added, brushing the dirt from her apron. "I'm sorry," I murmured, and I meant it. Despite everything she had done, my sorrow was genuine. Marjorie didn't cry. She didn't scream or crumble. She just stood there, facing the carrot rows, her shoulders rising and falling with each breath. Then, without turning, she said. Radishes will do well next to the carrots. The soil's right. It was the closest thing to a peace offering I would ever receive from her. In the months that followed, a quiet understanding settled between us. Not affection, not warmth, but a kind of shared silence that didn't hurt the way it used to. She never went back to her old ways, not completely. The yelling stopped, the belittling, even the alcohol, though not gone, came out less often, sometimes at night, when Teddy was asleep and Daddy was working late at the station. I'd find her on the porch, staring at the stars, and if she was holding her diary, I didn't ask. I just brought her a cup of tea and sat beside her. She started talking about Clara, not with tears, but in snippets, little memories, like fragments of a dream. Clara once tried to build a raft out of fence posts, she said one night. She thought she could float down the Ashley River and meet pirates. Another time, she had this habit of naming everything. The sewing machine, the broom, the weather, made the world feel smaller, I guess. I didn't say much in return, but I listened. Not out of obligation at first, maybe, but eventually, because I understood. Marjorie wasn't just a cruel woman. She was a mother whose grief had rotted inside her until it became something sharp. One night, she caught me lingering at the doorway. "You want to hate me," she said, not looking up from her lap. "But I think the worst of me already did the damage." I didn't answer, because she was right. But I also couldn't forget the woman who knelt beside Teddy through a night of fever, who whispered comfort when he cried for Mama, who tried, in her broken way, to show she could be more than the sum of her pain. One morning in June, as I swept the porch, she came outside with a parcel wrapped in brown paper. "So, you don't forget," she said, placing it on the railing beside me. I opened it weeks later. Inside was her diary, new pages added in her own careful script, and in the back, a letter. When Joseph brought me into this house, I saw in Teddy the son I'd never had, and in you, Etta, the girl who could take his love away. I turned my grief into poison. I don't expect forgiveness, but if someday you understand, I hope you'll use what you've learned for good. I folded the letter and pressed it to my chest. I didn't forgive her, not yet, maybe not ever, but in that moment, I understood her. And sometimes that's enough to let go of hate. Years passed, the way they always do, slowly, then all at once. In 1956, when I turned 19, Sophie returned to Damariscotta for good. She took a post as the new primary school teacher and brought with her the lightness and steadiness that I remembered from that afternoon in the church sacristy. She encouraged me to apply to the normal school in Portland. I was terrified. I'd never been further than Brunswick, but she helped me study, wrote my recommendation, and when the acceptance letter came, she was the first one I told. To my surprise, Marjorie didn't try to stop me. "You have a sharp mind," she said quietly, not quite looking at me. It'd be a waste not to use it. It was the closest thing to pride I ever heard in her voice. I left that fall, carrying with me Mama's old recipe notebook, Teddy's photograph tucked in the last page, and Marjorie's diary wrapped in cloth at the bottom of my bag. I didn't hate her anymore, but I still carried the marks of what we'd lived through, some visible, others not. When Daddy passed suddenly in 1968, Marjorie moved to Boston to live with a sister we'd never met. We exchanged letters for a while, stiff at first, then softer. She never asked for forgiveness, but she thanked me once for not letting the past swallow us whole. She died 7 years later in a nursing home. That same year, 1975, I founded the Damariscotta Shelter for Children, the first of its kind in our part of Maine. I used the money from selling my father's house and leaned heavily on Sophie, who was by then director of the county school board. We opened the doors in early spring. The walls smelled of fresh paint and promise. We had bunk beds, shelves of donated books, a tiny vegetable garden in the back, and we had Teddy, Dr. Theodore Stone. Now a pediatrician at a children's hospital in Portland, drove up once a month to give checkups, talk to the kids, and remind all of us that healing doesn't just happen in hospitals. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, a young reporter asked me why I chose this work. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked down at my hands, the same ones that had once scrubbed floorboards until they cracked, held a fevered child through the night, wrote secret signals in the dirt, and I told her the truth. Because the worst scars, I said, are the ones nobody sees, and I've learned that even the most broken people can be mended if someone believes they're worth the effort. We've helped hundreds of children since then. Some came from homes where silence was louder than screams. Some ran away with nothing but the clothes on their backs. But in every single one, I saw some piece of the 7-year-old Teddy trying to carry water too heavy for his little arms. And sometimes, in the brave girls who walked through our doors, I saw a reflection of myself. Not the frightened girl I used to be, but the one who refused to give up. Today, I'm 88 years old. My body's slower, and my bones ache when the weather changes. But my spirit, my purpose is stronger than ever. Teddy's a grandfather now. His grandchildren visit the shelter sometimes, and when they ask about the building's name, he always says, "My sister saved my life, twice, once on the night of the fever, and every day after that." Sometimes I still think of Marjorie, of Clara, and I wonder who they might have become if the world had been kinder, if someone had stepped in earlier, if grief had been treated like an illness instead of a shameful secret. I don't excuse what she did. But I understand what made her do it, and that understanding, that ability to face pain without becoming it, is what saved me. It's what saved Teddy, and it's what I hope, in some small way, can save others, too. If there's one thing I've learned in my long life, it's this: scars may shape us, but they don't have to define us. We all carry stories. Some we speak aloud. Some we whisper only in the dark. But healing begins when we tell the truth, when we protect those too small to protect themselves, and when we turn our pain into purpose. If my story touched something in you, if it reminded you of a moment you survived, a child you shielded, or a silence you're ready to break, I ask only this: share your voice, speak your truth, and please leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from, or simply say, "I'm still here," because sometimes those 3 words are enough to change everything. And if you haven't yet subscribed to this channel, so more stories like mine can find their way into the hands and hearts of those who need them most. From my porch in Damariscotta to wherever you are tonight, thank you for listening, and may you always be the light for someone still walking through the dark.